Hi, thank you for joining me today on the illusion of competence in theory and in practice. My name is Mark Branson. I'm the creator of the illusion of competence. Today, the main thing I want to talk about is why the history of leadership is relevant to your future in leadership. And in order to do that, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to share some of my experiences in leadership and how they led to the development of the illusion of competence. Try to explain how some of those experiences influence what you do today. So I started off my career in 1984 working for Target. And I was 18. I was very naive when I started working for Target. And I want to give you an example of just how naive I was, but I have to go back before Target. In fact, I have to go back all the way to when I was 5 years old. And when I was 5 years old, I was just learning how to read, and I was very excited that I knew how to read. So I was reading everything in sight. Well, one morning, I was reading my cereal box. And if you know, you've been 5, you know that cereal is the most important thing to you in your life. So I'm reading my cereal box, and I see on top it says, best if opened before. And then underneath it, it has a date. Well, the thing is, I hadn't been taught what dates were yet. I only knew how to read. So all I knew when I was 5 is that the thing that was most important to me in life said best if opened before. So I kid you not, for the next 2 years, I would not open a box of cereal, and I really didn't understand why my sisters would open a box of cereal. That didn't make any, obviously there was cereal scum on top of the cereal. Why would you want to be the first one to get it if it was best if opened before? So for 2 years, I didn't open a box of cereal. I only started opening box of cereals again when I learned dates 2 years later. So I was pretty naive as a 5-year-old. Now, as a 9-year-old, I learned that you could say a word that could upset someone. And I remember it was profound to me that something could come out of your mouth and it would make someone mad. And what was happening was my oldest sister was teasing my middle sister, and my middle sister was getting upset. And I was just amazed that it was only words that my sister was using to make her mad. So 9 years later, I'm working for Target, and so my maturity level has advanced 9 years in being naive. So when I start working for Target, I'm very naive, and what I find is that I trust my leaders. I trust my leadership when I start working for Target, and good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, I had good leaders, I had bad leaders. I gave them all the credit as leaders for whether they were good or bad, right? I didn't associate it with leadership itself. It was the individual that I trusted. So I trusted my leadership to do what was best for me. And it was years ago that this happened, and I didn't know it at the time, but as I reflect back on it, I realized that this was the first time that I started questioning my leaders in leadership. And my first big promotion at Target was to a stockroom supervisor. And the first thing you notice about being a stockroom supervisor is that you're not the stockroom manager. So as a stockroom supervisor, you actually answer to 5 different people, because there are 5 people above you in the chain that all have influence on the stockroom. And of course, I had to answer to the stockroom manager, but then I also had to answer to the receiving manager. The receiving manager is slotted above the stockroom manager in the hierarchy at Target. So if he came in and he said something, I had to listen to it. Additionally, Target had merchandise managers and operations managers and the store manager. All 3 of them were slotted up above. And as the stockroom supervisor, all 5 of them would come to me with ideas on how to do stuff. And what would happen is they weren't interacting with each other. They were only interacting with me. And when all is said and done, I could only make one of the 5 managers happy. And the illusion of competence has a lot of different sayings. And some saying stem as far back. Like I said, I didn't know it at the time, but they stem as far back at Target. What I learned as a stockroom supervisor, and this is where this saying comes from, if you do not respect the process, you will not improve the process. And when I was working in a Target stockroom, all I did was move boxes around. That's all I did was shift boxes from place to place. So no one respected that process. So they didn't care how hard I worked to move a box. It was just a box. Another saying stems from that time in the illusion of competence, which is you must be smarter than a box. And my experience has been that if you take it for granted, if you don't respect the process, the box is going to beat you up. That's what's going to happen. And my first experience with this was at Target. I was the stockroom supervisor. We had bicycles in the stockroom, and they're big flat boxes, but we had more than we knew what to do with. We had more than we could handle. And at that time at Target, they had an automotive bay. They did like tire rotations and oil changes. That's just basic automotive maintenance. Well, they got rid of that in the mid 80s. So we had this big automotive bay that was empty. And the people above me decided, well, hey, let's move all the bicycles that we don't have room for into the automotive bay across the store. And one of the funny things is the automotive bay couldn't be any farther away from where the bikes were currently sitting at. I mean, so it was a haul. Well, I spent 3 days dragging bikes across the floor on pallets, and the pallets are double stacked. And it's mule work. It's very difficult physical work to drag the bikes over there and to put them up in the automotive bay. Well, I get into the automotive bay and we discover there's not enough room in the automotive bay for all the bikes that we don't have room for in the stockroom. So again, a decision is made, well, we have storage units out back, so we're going to go ahead and put the bicycles in that storage unit. Any of that overflow that don't fit in the automotive bay, we're going to put them in the storage unit. So the overflow of bikes, I took another day and I moved them out into the storage containers out back. Shortly thereafter, again above me, someone decided, those bikes are too valuable to be sitting in storage containers out back. It's one thing to find toiletries in a storage container if you break into it. It's another thing to find hundreds of bicycles. So the decision was made, well, we can't keep those bicycles in the storage units. So the last decision was, we'll take all the bicycles that are in the automotive bay right now and move them back to the stockroom. And then all the bicycles that are in the storage units, we'll sort them out. So we'll get just like one style of bike, and that overflow we'll put into the automotive bay. Now, I had to do all that. So I did another 4 or 5 days of work. And that's when I started questioning my leaders and what they did. And at the time, I remember thinking, tell me what you want the end result to be, and I'll get it done, because I didn't want to work as hard as I was working. So that became my goal, was to focus on the end result, not the how, because the people telling me the how were just working me way too hard. And like I said, this is all a reflection after the fact. But what came to light was, I'm working for Famous Footwear in 1998. I'm promoted to a store manager, and I worked for Famous Footwear for 7 years. After 7 years, and it's the same thing, faith in my bosses and my leaders, that they were what they were, and there was no more to it when it came to leadership. And even at times when I was told to write a book, the thought was I would write a book about me and my experiences. The concept of leadership itself didn't really exist. So I'm working at Famous Footwear. I have different bosses that I get different results with. Well, I transferred to Lens Crafters in 2005, still retail, but a totally different industry. But what I notice is that Lens Crafters is experiencing the exact same problems that I had at Famous Footwear, and it seems like they're using the same playbook to try to fix it. And then this was my first concept that leadership was a thing, that it was an actual entity. When I saw LensCrafters doing the same things as Famous Footwear, that was really a light bulb that, hey, there's more to leadership than just my bosses. Maybe the shortcomings I see when I'm interacting with my bosses and their ideas. And because my biggest problem that I had at both Famous Footwear and at LensCrafters is the biggest problem that leadership has up until this day. And what that is engagement. Leadership can't get people engaged. When I worked at Famous Footwear, employees rejected ideas from corporate all the time. When I worked for LensCrafters, people rejected ideas all the time from corporate. And especially when it crossed over industries, I started thinking there has to be a reason why. Why is it that engagement's a problem in both of these places? That didn't, and it's not that it didn't make sense to me. What it told me was there has to be an underlying cause. So when I first started looking at leadership, that's what I was looking for, was the underlying causes. And even I was well on my way to completing the illusion of competence when I started studying the history of leadership. And what I found was that you find some interesting things when you look at leadership, at the history of leadership. So I'm going to go through those with you real quick. In the 1840s was really the first time leadership was addressed, and something called great man theory came out. And what great man theory essentially said was that when the world is faced with challenges, when the world is faced with trials and tribulations, a great man will come to the forefront. Great leaders rise to great occasions. That's the essence of great man theory. And the idea essentially of great man theory is that great men are born great. Everything they need to be great already exists within them on their way to greatness. So they're great because they're great. And one thing I like about great man theory, or that I find kind of humorous, is that great man theory said that when a great man was identified, you offered deference to him. You deferred to the great man. In other words, you got out of his way, you got behind him, you followed him because he was going to be great. You didn't challenge the great man, I assume, unless you were another great man. But essentially, the great man was born. That was the idea behind great man theory. And that held prevalence actually for 90 years until the 1930s. And in the 1930s, trait theory came out. And trait theory is really just an extension of great man theory. But what trait theory says is that a great man has all of these traits that allow him to be great. So trait theory says we're going to identify these traits that make a man great. So yes, it's still innate. He's born with these traits, but there's specific traits. And one thing about trait theory is that it's quickly dismissed by by leadership theories that come after trait theory, are quick to point out, oh, that trait theory has been disproven. And I'll explain why that is later. Now, the next theory to come to light was behaviorism, or behaviorist theories of leadership. And these were the polar opposite of great man theory and trait theory, in that behaviorists believe that you're born with none of the traits to be a great leader, but everything you need to be a great leader, we can teach you. We can teach you how to be a great leader. And the behaviorists will point out that, the biggest flaw in trait theory is that they couldn't do research that identified what the trait was that caused someone to be great. So they're like, okay, that's discredited. So they went to the other extreme and said, hey, we're going to teach you everything you need to know about leadership. And what's interesting is that behaviorist theory has also been largely discredited since its time. And that during the 1940s, there were two studies, the Ohio State University studies and Michigan University studies. And those studies are still referenced to this day, but they were based on behaviorist ideas, and they were research based on behaviorist ideas. But those ideas have largely been disproven by future theories or over the course of time. But behaviorists will tell you how quickly trait theory is dismissed, but they don't mention that the same thing has happened to behaviorist theories. Now, after behaviorist theories, and this was in the 40s and 50s that behaviorist theories were popular. In the 60s, contingency theory came out, and contingency theory says that more than anything else, contingency theory says that there's no one best leadership style, that you have to pull a bunch of leadership styles, and it's contingent upon the situation. So hence situational leadership too, you can say are contingency theories, and those came out in the 1960s. Now in the 1970s, transformational theory came out, and transformational theory counts on charisma and inspiration for the leader to get the followers to follow. I'm going to be charismatic, and I'm going to inspire you to follow me, and together we're going to be great. That's transformational theory. Now, when you study leadership, a lot of the research stops in the 1970s, and that's when I started looking at research. That was the first thing that stood out to me, was that the research that I looked at was as old as my parents, was from the 1970s. And to me, when I started looking at everything that exists today, that tells me that there's a problem with leadership. One of the first problems is everything is so old, and one of hundreds of books on leadership come out from year to year. You can find all kinds of leadership, and leadership has a habit of taking old ideas and introducing them as new and exciting. This happens all the time in leadership. And the whole purpose of all of this is when I started, I was very naive and I trusted my leadership. And then I got to the point where I started questioning, should I have that trust in my leadership? And I share this with you because I like to think I'm not the only one that has taken time to realize that the things my bosses do, the things my company do, are dictated by their leadership style. And one thing you notice if you work in a company, which I'm assuming all of you do or want to, it is very hard to identify what leadership philosophy they follow. And that's by design by the company, that's designed by leadership. You already heard that, there is no one best leadership style. That's so that you really can't challenge. If there's something in leadership that you don't like, it's very difficult to challenge if it's not specific, if it's not tied down. And I'll give you, and this is something I just learned in the last couple of weeks, just doing some quick research. And I was trying to explain to myself how I can tell you guys that leadership hasn't advanced in 50 years. And the first thing that I looked at was Bill George and True North. True North came out in 2007, and that's all about authentic leadership. And when I was researching, when I shared the information on the history of leadership, I went to a specific website that matched my idea of what leadership is, meaning that in the context, it matches my understanding of leadership. But the website went farther, trying to categorize the different types of leadership. So it would categorize what falls under transformational leadership, what falls under contingency leadership. And what I noticed was servant leadership wasn't listed anywhere as underneath transformational leadership or behavioral leadership. Authentic leadership wasn't listed anywhere as a behavior-based leadership theory. And this is literally just research that I'm looking at. And one of the reasons that leadership doesn't want you to lock down what those leadership styles are, what those leadership theories are, is so that they can present something like True North and authentic leadership as new and exciting. When I did the basic research on, what can you tell me about authentic leadership? Authentic leadership actually dates back to 1943 in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And just to test that theory, when I learned that, if you know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a pyramid is a big part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Well, if you Google True North, if you look at the teachings of authentic leadership, you'll find pyramids, because the concept is from 1943. It's from the late 1930s, when Maslow's hierarchy of needs was being developed. That's where authentic leadership comes from. And that's the point that I'm trying to make to you guys is look at how old you are now. Look at the age of your parents. I know what my parents is. My mom was born after Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Authentic leadership is tied to that, and it's presented to you as new and exciting all the time. Same thing with servant leadership. The same website didn't identify servant leadership as transformational or any other type of leadership. And when you go specifically into authentic leadership, as you go specifically into servant leadership, what you discover is that they try to present themselves as their own leadership entity. So authentic leadership is its own leadership. Servant leadership is its own leadership. And that's another trick to be able to present you, to tell you, hey, I'm new and exciting, I'm servant leadership. Hey, I'm new and exciting, I'm empathetic leadership. Hey, I'm new and exciting, I'm inspirational leadership. They seem very similar because they all come from the same place. And you see this when you look at the practicers, the people that they say, hey, these are the people in history that practice authentic leadership. These are the people that practice empathetic leadership, that practice servant leadership. The names are the same. And a lot of the names existed before the theory existed in general. Martin Luther King Jr. is always listed. Mother Teresa is always listed as an authentic leader. She's always listed as a servant leader. She's always listed as an empathetic leader, even though she existed before those times. So there's not that great of a difference between any one of these theories, and they all tie back to behaviorist theories. Servant leadership says you need to have these certain qualities. It has to be a quality. It has to be a calling. You have to want to serve. Stewardship is involved, and then empathy, and then a bunch of other behaviors that you need to have. You go to authentic leadership, you have many of the exact same behaviors are listed. And servant leadership, it's like you can find as many as 18 different behaviors you have to have. With authentic leadership, it's at least 10 different behaviors you have to have. And there's a lot of overlap because they all come from the same place. And that's one thing you notice about when you study leadership. Everyone says they're a student of leadership. And there's a technical reason for that. There's a reason why the different gurus on LinkedIn tell you that they're a student of leadership. And the reason for that is because the institution of leadership, the entity of leadership, firmly believes that everything you need to know about leadership already exists, that it's already contained within the institution of leadership. So there's nothing learned. You can't be a teacher of leadership if you're only sharing what you've learned. So you have to be a student of leadership. And no one describes himself as a historian of leadership for the same reason, because when you start studying leadership, generally speaking, you pick a specific style, like I'm going to be a servant leadership, I'm going to be an authentic leader, and then you get immersed in those teachings. And when you're immersed in those teachings, you don't see them from an outside perspective. You only see them from the inside, looking out at the world. So you don't get the chance to see the defects in the theories that you follow when you're with them. And that's why people that are students of leadership they might see the history of leadership, but they don't really study how effective all of these things have been over time. And that's when you get to 2023 and you find that engagement in the US is at 32%, that 78% of employees or I'm sorry, 68% of employees are disengaged at their jobs, 30% are actively sabotaging their jobs. Companies blame the manager, they blame the frontline managers for not getting their employees engaged when they should be blaming the leadership philosophies that are disengaging employees, because that's when you want to look at why something's disengaged, look at the fact that you're teaching what you're being taught is 50 years old, and you realize that you listen to leadership about as well as you listen to your parents, which isn't very well at all. You become independent of your thinking. But the concern is that you're where I was 20 years ago, thinking in terms of leadership is my boss, leadership is their boss, not realizing that they all work within the frameworks provided by the institution of leadership. And I find it interesting that when you look at all the big companies, it's hard to determine what type of leadership theory they follow. And the easiest one is servant leadership, but that's because that's the easiest one to qualify for. All you have to do to be a servant, to say I'm a servant leadership company, excuse me, is, and keep in mind, if you want to be a servant leader, you have to have these 18 different behaviors. But if you want to be a servant leadership company, all you need to do is mention servant leadership somewhere in your bylaws, somewhere in your employee handbook. You have to say we're a servant leadership company, and you qualify. That's why you see companies like 7-Eleven say I'm a servant leadership company. And the company that do lock down specifically, Starbucks says we're a servant leadership company. Southwest Airlines says we're a servant leadership company. Well, when you have problems at those companies, which over the last few years, both Southwest and Starbucks have had issues, if you will. Well, those issues don't get tied specifically to servant leadership. That's not what's blamed. And in fact, when blame comes home to roost, you don't hear mentioned that Starbucks is a servant leadership company. You don't hear mentioned that Southwest Airlines is a servant leadership company when they're having breakdowns in their operations of some sort. But make no mistake, those philosophies dictate the experience that you have at your company. The reason why you struggle to get your employees engaged is because your company's ideas aren't good enough. And if you track the history of leadership, it helps you at least start to break down that trust that you have in your leaders and you have in their leadership philosophy, because the whole system is designed for you to not really be able to challenge the specific leadership philosophy. It kills me that in servant leadership, you can get fired, and somehow they can do you a favor and fire you. And Starbucks has a point system that can be people say can be pretty heartless in getting rid of people. Well, that's in conflict with the ideas of servant leadership. And the illusion of competence says only write people up when you want to fire them, when the goal is termination. So servant leadership has a mechanism built in that says you can terminate people. This is how. Servant leadership has the mechanism. What they don't have is the explanation as to how they can justify it, and they don't try to justify it, because leadership operates off of vague generalities. That is where the institution of leadership shines, is in presenting you with vague generalities that make it hard to challenge the things that you see. And it's all designed for you just to accept your 50-year-old leadership theories, your 70-year-old leadership theories, and how they impact you in your future. The illusion of competence was designed with all of those shortcomings in mind. And I didn't finish the illusion of competence until 2016. And I still speak to it to this day. So even as new things arise, I can incorporate those into the illusion of competence. The institutional leadership presents everything as new and exciting when it's old and boring. I hope you found this talk useful today. Thank you very much for listening to me, to giving me the time. And I'll see you next week on the illusion of competence in theory and in practice. And I am working on my training courses. I want to get the courses done, then I'll start the promotion for them. But their whole goal is to teach people how to be an illusionist and for deeper insights as a master illusionist into the philosophies that I follow, which I'll be sharing with you next week. Have a great weekend. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.